Paul Morphy had a beautiful relationship with the king's gambit. Of course, that is the sharp gambit opening that white plays to open up lines for attack as quickly as possible. This game today was played on his first big European tour. He was playing in London against Jacob Lowenthal. And according to the Wikipedia page of Lowenthal, he actually invented the big chess demonstration boards they used in tournaments so everyone could see what was being played on the board. He was a very strong player. He didn't have a lot of money. The prize for this match was £100, of course, the currency of Great Britain. And Morphy did win the match. He won the £100, and then as a gesture to Lowenthal, bought £120 worth of furniture and gave it to him. So a very nice gesture on Morphy's part. He was nicer off the board than he was on it. Let's take a look at this beautiful game from Paul Morphy. He begins with e4, Lowenthal responds with e5, and of course f4. The king's gambit is on the board. Lowenthal plays bishop to c5. Now, there's a little trap here, not one that Morphy would fall for, of course, but the idea is that if white takes on e5, he's in huge trouble. Really, he's lost already. After queen to h4 check, if you play king to e2, that's all sorts of problems, but if you play g3, then queen takes e4 check, and you're hitting the king and you win the rook, and basically the game is over. So Morphy plays the correct move, of course, knight to f3. d6 is played and c3. He's aiming for a big center. He wants to support this pawn push to d4. Bishop to g4 pins the knight. He could just play h3 here, that's fine, but he plays bishop to e2. And you'll notice as this game develops, Morphy, he gets a nice center and does everything he can to make it indestructible. So he's just basically removing the pin so that knight can help support the d4 push. Now Lowenthal takes on f3. Today, modern players wouldn't play a move like this, but in the swashbuckling era, they did. They weren't interested in positional stuff as much as tactical stuff, but Morphy now has the bishop pair without having to fight for it. Knight to c6 and b4, gaining space on the wing. This is the kind of move modern computers actually like. They like these advancing the pawns on the wings with tempo. The bishop goes back, then plays b5, gaining more space, hitting the knight. The knight goes to e7 and d4. Morphy gets what he was after, right? He gets his pawn center. The best way for Lowenthal to deal with this is to take on d4, and after cd4, d5, playing on those light squares. And when Morphy plays e5, knight to f5, attacking the d-pawn twice. And black has a perfectly good position here, actually. Black is fine in this position. But Lowenthal instead takes on f4, and that allows Morphy to get this really nice pair of pawns in the center. And again, watch how Morphy makes that center indestructible. He takes the pawn. Now knight to g6 gains a tempo against that bishop. The bishop goes back to e3. Again, adding a defender to d4, making it indestructible. And notice this bishop on b6 is very unhappy right now. It has almost no mobility at all. Knight to f6, knight to d2, defending e4, castles, and h6. Probably Lowenthal was worried about the move bishop to g5, afraid that pin might cause him all kinds of trouble. Now Morphy plays a4. Again, a modern move, threatening a5, trapping the bishop, and gaining space. Lowenthal plays c6 to give the bishop a hiding place on c7. Morphy just connects his rooks with queen to e2, rook to e8, putting a second attacker on e4. Morphy plays queen to d3, adding a third attacker and getting the queen out from the aim of that rook. So Morphy's center, it's very clear, is very strong and really indestructible. Here, Lowenthal plays d5. The better move is probably rook to c8, with the idea of taking on b5 or recapturing on c6 with the rook and getting some play down the c-file. But he plays d5, going after the light squares. The problem is it allows Morphy to create a very strong pawn wedge in the center with e5, with tempo by hitting that knight on f6. The knight goes to d5, and then bishop to h5. Now with that space advantage, he's already threatening to win material by taking twice on g6 with the bishop and then the queen. So black plays rook to e6 to defend that knight. Now, I want to look at a variation here to understand how the game unfolds. If Morphy were to play the sacrifice, rook takes f7 here, it would not work. And the reason is knight takes e5. And after pawn takes, knight takes e5. And he is forking the rook and the queen, and he's putting pressure on the bishop on e3. And that would be too much. So white's queen could not go to f5 to defend the rook, because black would just play bishop takes e3 with check. So what Morphy does instead is he plays a5, moving that bishop away from that diagonal. The bishop goes to c7, and now, you know what Morphy did? That's right. Now, rook takes f7, and now it works, because there's no pressure on this diagonal anymore, on this bishop on e3. If knight takes e5 here, pawn takes knight e5, then just queen to f5, and the bishop is fine on e3. If knight takes rook, just take with check, and then you take, and Morphy would just be up 2 minor pieces, and that would be the end of the game. So he has to take the rook with his king. King takes f7, but now queen to f5 check. It hits the rook, it hits the king, and it hits the knight on g6 twice along with the bishop. He has to make a choice. He obviously is going to decide to keep the rook, so he plays king to e7, but that does leave the knight. So bishop takes g6. Technically, black still has a material advantage, a pawn and a minor piece in exchange for a rook, but obviously Morphy is much, much better here with more active pieces and a safer king. Queen to g8 defends the rook at e6, but also prepares to shift the rook to f8, gaining a tempo against the queen and getting the open file. Morphy plays this move, bishop to f2, basically threatening to play to h5 with check, where the king would have nowhere to go. If rook to f8, then bishop to h4 check, and black would be forced to block that with a piece, and Morphy would just take it. So instead, what Lowenthal does is he takes on e5. The idea is, yes, he's giving some material back, but his king can move to d7 and maybe be able to get away from all of these threats of the bishop checks on h4. So Morphy takes the knight, rook to f8. Now, bishop h4 check is still strong here, but as it turns out, by allowing Morphy to take on e5, he's opened up a second diagonal for that bishop, and Morphy shifts to c5 with bishop to c5 check, skewering the king and the rook. When the king moves, Morphy takes on f8. Lowenthal takes on e5 with his rook. Morphy plays the queen back to f2 to stay in contact with, to defend that bishop on f8. Queen to e6. Lowenthal attacks the bishop on g6. Maybe he's threatening to get some activity with the rook on e2. Morphy plays b6, hitting the bishop. Pawn takes, and if the bishop goes back to b8, then just bishop takes g7, hitting the rook after queen takes g6. Rook to a8 pins, and if queen goes, you can just play bishop takes e5. If the queen takes the bishop, then queen to f8 would win everything. If the bishop goes to d6 instead, then you just take, and knight to f3 hits the rook, and Morphy's up two pieces. So instead, Lowenthal takes on g6, but of course, bishop takes c7 check, king takes c7, and rook to b1, threatening queen to b6 and all kinds of nastiness. And in this position, Lowenthal did resign. If he played, say, b5 to avoid that queen to b6 move, then the rook could just shift to a1, and he's still going to be destroyed over on the queen side. Interestingly, after this match, Lowenthal won one of the biggest tournaments in Great Britain, the British Chess Congress. So he was a very, very strong opponent for Morphy. But with Morphy, well, he kind of makes it look easy. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.